Age of Ultron is odd. It thinks a dark tone and a hero movie are somehow opposites, and tries to set up too much. But there is grace in its failings. I think the fanboys missed that. I ended my last video saying that Age of Ultron is a perfect sequel, and I believe I should explain myself properly. Back in 2015, when Age of Ultron came out, the immediate reaction to that movie was that it was a mediocre follow-up to the first one. To some, it felt less like a natural progression and more like an attempt to one-up itself constantly. The movie starts by having a huge, continuous shot of the battlefield as to try and kick the door down on the way in. It has a wider, more cinematic aspect ratio rather than the more TV-like one from the previous entry, and goes for a more well-defined color grading with the teal-orange tint that, in my opinion, worked well on some scenes, but not all of them. There are more jokes, higher stakes, more hero-on-hero action, and the movie makes every possible attempt to surpass the spectacle that was Marvel's The Avengers. Ironically, Age of Ultron has aged really well, compared to other movies from earlier Marvel phases. With the benefit of hindsight, it is easy to realize that this movie is so much more than the fans gave it credit for at release. It single-handedly carries on its shoulders the weight of setting up the entire Phase 3 of Marvel, including Civil War, Infinity War and Endgame, Thor Ragnarok, Black Panther, and even Phase 4's WandaVision. 7 whole years later, the foundation laid by Age of Ultron still stands as the cornerstone of Marvel's ultimate success. Not only that, it also doubles as Joss Whedon's best comic book movie. It features Joss at peak writing as well as some of his best cinematography ever. It is his goodbye letter to the MCU, not because he didn't like it anymore, but because these two movies, his babies, took a toll on him creatively and professionally. Having been given full creative control to oversee Phase 2 through to the end, he had everything lined up to make the perfect Avengers movie, to make the first one look like low-budget television in comparison. But he also faced some of his worst obstacles yet. Firstly, not since Iron Man 2 had a sequel had so many expectations looming over it. They had the world's full attention now. It wasn't a game anymore. They were in for war. Everyone expected a lot from this movie. They wanted it to be bigger, better, deeper, funnier, hyper, to go beyond. They wanted larger stakes, more of that wonderful character work, a better villain, kick-ass action scenes, and more spectacle than ever before. Secondly, as if facing the entire world was not hard enough, there was also an enemy within. One executive to ruin them all, to meddle and mess with the creatives behind the films. Ike Perlmutter. This man was the one responsible for a lot of the worst decisions inside Marvel at the time. He was the one that most butchered Iron Man 2, the reason why Terrence Howard didn't return as Colonel James Rhodes, why Patty Jenkins didn't direct Thor Ragnarok, why Edgar Wright left the direction of Ant-Man, and why Joss Whedon left the Avengers to the Russos after Age of Ultron. Nowadays, our Lord and Savior Kevin Feige, may his rule be forever, calls most shots in nearly every creative decision. But at one point, his clash with Perlmutter made him almost quit Marvel Studios entirely. Can you imagine that? A word without Zeddy Feige at the wheel? I shudder at the thought. Age of Ultron had a war to win, with enemies on both sides. It had lots of things going for it, but even more against it. A lot of people think that Age of Ultron is a disappointment, that it's what's wrong with Marvel. This video isn't just about a review, it's about whether they're right.
We're just gonna let them take it.
As we did before, let's lay out the situation around this movie's production and release. Let's reveal the maps of this battlefront and outline the threats. On the Eastern Front, we have the previous Avengers movie and its titanic success looming over its younger brother like a distorted shadow, turning what should be a reminder of quality and a sign of good faith into a dangerous whirlwind of hype, expectations, and terribly demanding fans. The first movie had to deal with the pressure of being the first ever Avengers level movie. That is no simple task, but Age of Ultron had to deal with the pressure of living up to the first ever Avengers level movie. In many ways, being a successor takes a different, much deeper toll on someone than being a founder. A founder has to honor its followers by laying out good foundations. The successor has to deal with the misgivings of its forefathers while still keeping the ball high for what's to come later. This is the kind of setup that can ruin companies, businesses, and even families. Speaking of successors, if we turn our backs to the past and look over at the Western Front, we have the second big enemy, an old rival of Joss from back in 2012, the Universe, Phase 3 to be exact. This movie had to bridge the gap between a moderately large universe with a reasonable cast of characters from Phase 2 and whatever the hell Endgame is. It's not just about proving this universe can work, it's about making it work, getting down and dirty and doing the ungrateful work of expositing, setting up, connecting, preparing the soil only so other posterior movies can reap the benefits. Being squashed between two sets of obligations means that Age of Ultron had total freedom to be anything but what it wanted to be. Joss can make any movie he wanted, so long as it was also a movie that worked under these conditions, under the need to be a bigger, better sequel, while also making a balancing act between its own plot and the future of the expanding universe. Oh, and it also had to be studio approved, which meant that Whedon wasn't even the one giving the orders. Instead, it was the Ministry of War propaganda that tried to dictate the battle strategies. This is the third big battle this movie had to fight. It is a movie that is at war with itself. A movie divided, cut to pieces, reduced to a studio-mandated 2 hours and 20 minutes of almost entirely advertising for Marvel's future projects. A movie that was forced to have a cave. A movie that almost didn't have a farm. The production and pre-production periods of Age of Ultron were frequently described by Joss himself as hell or terrible. Unlike the first time around, where he had every card laid in front of him and was given the order to go all in, he was now an old, tired general, trying to win an impossible war while being stripped of his power and authority day by day. His original cut of the movie was over 3 hours long. There wasn't a single cave in it. Ultron was way more fleshed out, and the Vision was an actual character for more than just 2 scenes. Some could even say it was a Whedon cut. We're not gonna go there. Let's just understand for now that this movie is not all it could be, not even close. It was a movie with every reason to be terrible, to fail, to be a disgrace in the eyes of the audience. But it isn't. Age of Ultron is not even close to terrible. Rather, I'd say it's incredible, impossible, memorable, remarkable. What other word could I use to describe something that doesn't get beat down no matter how many enemies it faces? Oh yeah, right. This movie is. How to define a perfect sequel? Of course, the answer to that question is hardly objective. It doesn't warrant a straightforward answer, but rather a more broad, generalistic one. For the sake of brevity, I will merely define the parameters I believe are most valid and how each one will be used to measure Age of Ultron. Going back to the analogy I constructed earlier, the first Avengers movie and the collective efforts of phases 1 and 2 are now adversaries, rivals that this movie has to face. Or rather, the hype and expectations they generated are. The success of the previous movies caused the expectations for this one to be much higher than they should be in a healthy situation. What can be considered a good sequel after all? Well, firstly, it has to be larger and or deeper in scale. A good sequel will expand the universe in a meaningful and satisfying way, pay off what was built up, and set up new payoffs. Take the Shrek films, for example. Shrek 1 could be described as simply a modernized fairy tale that subverts the genre tropes into a new mix and uses them as tools for a story. If the series ended there, no one would assume or inquire more about this world, its rules and history, and its other minute details. We would just assume it's a fairy tale land with fairy tale people. Shrek 2 completely undoes that assumption by solidifying a world with customs, history, life, conflict, rules, important figures and places, and medieval capitalism. It stops being just a modern fairy tale satire and becomes a full-on modern fairy tale full stop. In this more defined, more complex world, the characters can explore and interact with stories and systems that an open-ended satirical take on fantasy worlds would never allow for. In that sense, Shrek 2 is a perfect sequel. It's not necessarily the obvious logical step, but definitely the right one. Secondly, a good sequel has to progress the character arcs without undoing what was done before. Character development is the most satisfying reward for following along with a story. Watching Captain America go from a black and white war superhero in the first Avenger to a moral man in an amoral world in the Winter Soldier, and finally, a man who will defy his own country for the sake of his friends and what he believes in Civil War, is extremely enjoyable, and definitely one of the most well-executed developments in the MCU. Likewise, if we look at Shrek 2 again, we can see that despite having faced many trials and tribulations in the first movie, Shrek still didn't learn to love himself or who he is. Rather, he is still trying to become who he thinks he needs to be to make Fiona happy. He notices how the king, the nobles in the entire city of Far Far Away look at him and tries desperately to become something else, only to find out Fiona loves him just as he is, and that he should love himself too. These two examples show how good character development can make or break a series. Imagine if Loki always stayed the same throughout the 4 movies. He would become a gag character rather than an actual beloved counterpart to Thor, and his death would have no impact on the audience or on the other characters in Infinity War. Finally, a good sequel has to up the stakes and raise the tension without breaking the power scale or undoing previous developments. Here, I will use a negative example. Take God of War 2. In the start, you have every power and item Kratos had by the end of the previous game. However, since progression is more important in a game than internal consistency, the game has to find a way to strip you of all your powers, so that you can face this new game from a fresh starting point. I understand why this happens, but it doesn't make that decision any less boring and annoying. Why instead weren't we given more powerful enemies to fight and new powers to unlock on top of the previous foundation? That would make for a much cooler experience and an even more layered final result. At least God of War still tries to justify it, and there are even examples of games that do this trope very well. One of them is Shadows of War, which takes away your spectral powers temporarily for the first chapter until you get through the tutorial zone, only to get them all back by the second chapter. From there, every new power you get is a step up from anything the previous game had to offer, making combat much more fun, diverse, and badass. In short, these are the 3 aspects of a sequel that will make or break it. Note that there is a clear distinction between a good film and a good sequel. A movie can be good as a film while being a terrible sequel, although most good sequels are also good films. Now, how does Age of Ultron stack up in each aspect? And I'd say pretty well. I'd say it does a good job. And okay, I know that is the point of the video, from the title, the thumbnail, and everything, but just give me a minute and let me try and justify why it does a great job as a sequel. In regards to scale, Age of Ultron goes both larger in its set pieces and action moments, as well as the size of the thread, and deeper in its themes and world building. It meaningfully adds to the lore of the world, introducing new places, new names, new rules, new tools, and new objects that will recurrently be used in later movies to advance the plot and move the story forward and outwards. Here, the scales grow and progress in natural yet appealing ways. The battles that featured a few moments of collaboration among heroes now rely entirely on that interplay between those heroes and how their powers complement each other. The enemies are more in sync and provide a better spectacle than ever. New characters and new places are introduced, as well as some very key objects and information. The entire movie works to show how the Avengers learned and evolved from their first fight and the experiences throughout Phase 2. The Iron Legion is a direct consequence of Iron Man 3, for example, in a response to the question of how the Avengers clean up their mess. The Hydra base and the Scepter all stem from the events of Captain America Winter Soldier and give gravitas to the fact that shield no longer exists. The events of Phase 2 all worked in tandem to allow this movie to be as big as it possibly could at the time, which leads me to my second point. Every event of Phase 2 was designed so that we could go into this movie with all the groundwork laid. The character development that would take us from the newly formed Avengers to the more experienced and battle-hardened ones we see here was all outlined and executed throughout these films. The obvious standouts would be Iron Man 3, Captain America 2, and Thor 2. Each of those movies explored the new aspect of the Big Three, to varying effects. Thor was put through the first wave of misery that would lead into his character arc in Infinity War and Endgame. Cap was forced to deal with the reality of the modern world, a grayer world where our enemies and our missions aren't always black and white, good or bad. Most importantly, Tony had to deal with the consequences of his heroic and not so heroic acts. I think Tony's PTSD in Iron Man 3 was a genius direction to take the character and works so nicely to underline his obsession with protecting the world, with protecting Pepper, who is his one and only love, and protecting the other Avengers who are his only friends. That goes right into the heart of Age of Ultron's premise. The truth is, Age of Ultron has miles more character development in its runtime than the first Avengers movie ever tried to have. It offers not only a deeper look into how or why these people act and think like they do, but also touches on topics like the direct consequences of their meddling, or what would happen if, for example, one of these gods among men lost control. These all culminate in Civil War, obviously, but this movie was the first of the entire Infinity Saga to explicitly approach this subject. It was also the most notable opportunity to see them in casual, non-hero situations. Clint has a family, Rogers wants one, and Tony is avoiding one out of fear. Banner and Nat simply can't have one, and that's an awful thing to have weighing down on your mental health. Pietro and Wanda are a family, the only one they have left, and that also has different effects on how they go about saving people. Given enough time, the exploration of these aspects would add infinitely more depth to every other action scene in the movie. And yet, I believe the most overlooked or even hated achievement of this movie was in its stakes. I will circle back to this later, but Ultron was a great villain. I would say he was even more interesting than Loki for his time, ignoring any later developments in Loki's character. He had much clearer motivations, was much less of a standard big bad evil guy, and even goes through his own arc, all within the duration of this single movie. He is not carried over from other films, nor the culmination of a decade-long build-up. Instead, he is a more typical villain with a less typical character. In the previous movie, defeating the Chitauri was a matter of closing the portal. In this movie, there is no such thing. They have to deactivate every single Ultron unit and stop the Sokovia meteor from crashing down, all while also evacuating everyone still stuck in the city. The final battle has much higher stakes than a simple win-lose, and those stakes will ripple through the rest of Phase 3. Even before that, Ultron being an enemy with virtually no real body means he was basically immortal while connected to the internet, and he was not shy on letting himself be destroyed to confuse and distract his enemies. He not only leaves the Avengers in the dark, scattered and broken, but he also completely embarrasses them in front of the whole world. Of course, the Avengers can fight him and destroy his drones with ease, but he is still coming out on top consistently, just because he doesn't play by the same rules other villains play. He's not trying to win every battle, he's trying to win the war, and he came damn close to doing it. Had the pacing of the movie been a little less cluttered, I firmly believe that Ultron would stand out more for the actual threat that he was and for how well Joss executed his vision on him. Get it? Vision. I'm gonna move on from this. Anyways, as we can see, Age of Ultron stacks pretty damn well as a follow-up to previous installments, and especially as a sequel to Marvel's The Avengers. Forgiven the road bumps here and there, I'd say it did a good job at virtually every level. Why then was it received so less bombastically in comparison to its predecessor? A couple of reasons. One of them is how the movie was marketed. And this might sound like a bad excuse, but the marketing for this movie really did no favors for it in hindsight. The trailers for it were all structured to make it look as if Ultron was gonna reach what only Thanos would accomplish eventually, be a cataclysmic event in the world, one that would shatter the very fabric of our superhero establishment. In reality, he was only the straw that broke the camel's back, unleashing what would eventually be Civil War and what would ultimately lead into Infinity War. None of that is bad nor necessarily inferior in any way, just not as big and eventful as it was made out to be by the teasers. There's also the fact that the movie Ultron was more playful and emotional than his comic book counterpart, which fans took poorly at first. Add to it a lot of setup that makes no sense unless you know what's being set up, and you have a much less streamlined and straightforward movie experience. It's not a base level massive blockbuster, but a centerpiece for something much bigger. It can't help feeling less self-important in comparison. Actually, that is exactly the other reason. There is a lot being set up here, because after all, there is another battlefront that this movie has to fight on. The Western enemies and their glorious tempting promise. The enemy that Marvel's The Avengers had to deal with before. The universe that was being built, and at the time, the entirety of Phase 3. Setups, groundwork, world building, continuity, progression, conflict, resolution. Continuous bursts of fire from the enemy Gatling guns. From within their bunkers, they rain hell on this side of the line. Our soldiers scurrying to find cover and squeeze themselves into the trenches. Foreshadowing, MacGuffins, exposition, lore, development. The loud roar of the machine gun makes our eardrums ring in agony. The Director General is being pressured to end the battle swiftly and take down the adversary. But the need for rest and room to breathe is urgent as the morale falls lower and lower, plummeting down to unbearable depths. There, under the never-ending ring of lead, lies a no man's land that no one dares to cross. This little dramatization feels to me like a pretty accurate metaphor for what it must have felt like to direct Age of Ultron. Before it even hit theaters, it already had shadows of bigger projects being cast upon it by rumors of a Civil War and an Infinity War movie. Add to that the significantly higher bar that some of the Phase 2 movies set, and the picture is complete. This was the position that Joss was in, one I definitely wouldn't envy him for. Age of Ultron couldn't just be a good sequel. Nope, it had the duty, the need to be a good prequel to all of Phase 3. It was birthed into the role of a rejected middle child of the black sheep of the family. Saying it had big shoes to fill is like saying the universe is huge. You're not quite wrong, but that doesn't really convey the reality of it. And yet, this rejected child, doomed to be overshadowed by the brilliance of its younger and older brothers, is the biting agent that holds the entire thing together. It was the one that took on the burden of the boring chores, while every other kid was playing outside, the one who made their future feasible. What I'm saying is, Age of Ultron has its scars because of it, but it did end up as the perfect prequel to Phase 3. Being shoved into the role of a link between bigger projects is hard on any artistic endeavor, but being competent enough to write it back home after just gives me a whole new layer of appreciation for this movie, one that only hindsight could provide. Ultimately, that was the compromise that this movie had to make, be the last bombastic release, the least eye-catching product, only to end up being the most vital. Admittedly, it is tempting to only mention these facts when talking about this movie. How it sets up Civil War and Homecoming and Infinity War and WandaVision and whatnot. It is tempting because it's one of the most notable strengths of this movie. Crawling on its belly, it crossed the hellscape and came out the other side, penetrating the enemy lines and leaving its mark for years to come. Under the careful hand of its commander, the movie managed to avoid problems like power creep, stagnation, scope fatigue, and many others easy to spot yet hard to avoid problems of a bigger, better, stronger approach to sequels. It is easy to compare it to what came before and say it looks better, has better character work, better dialogue, and cinematography, but what most people tend to blatantly disregard or naively ignore is how well Age of Ultron can stand by itself. How good of a film Joss Whedon managed to make in the context he was in, with the tools he was given, and with the challenges he had to overcome. Because Age of Ultron is not just a near-perfect sequel and an almost flawless prequel, it is also a damn good movie.
Do you see the beauty of it? The inevitability. You rise, only to fall. You, Avengers, you are my meteor, my swift and terrible sword, and the earth will crack with the weight of your failure. Purge me from your computers, turn my own flesh against me. It means nothing. When the dust settles, the only thing living in this world will be metal.
At its core, Avengers Age of Ultron is a movie with a lot of heart. A movie about humanity, about fear, about the conflict of freedom versus stability, and about taking responsibility. It approaches some interesting themes, but most importantly, it uses these themes as a gateway to deepen the characters, which are definitely the main driving force of every great MCU movie. As I stated previously, this saga is all about its characters and their arcs, while the world around them and the plots they go through are just tools to allow us to peek into their heads and hearts. At its best, Marvel excels at creating compelling friendships, families, bonds that last through the years. At its worst, a Marvel movie fails in making you care about them. Movies like Captain Marvel or Thor: The Dark World ultimately fail in making compelling conflicts for these characters. Contrasting them with Thor Ragnarok or Captain America Winter Soldier makes this difference clear as day. This movie falls comfortably within the first category of Marvel at its best. Not to say that this is their best movie, but it definitely is closer to the top than it is the bottom. Scenes like the after party, the farm, and the final confrontation between Vision and Ultron's last body just help sell the seriousness that this movie is trying to go for. Rather than doing a play-by-play, let me inspect the scenes that carry the most emotional weight in this movie individually. Starting with arguably the most memorable scene in the entire film. The after party scene is, simply put, a masterclass in character writing and dialogue direction. In a brief few minutes, we go around the table to examine the question of who can lift Thor's hammer. The response each one of them gives to it helps outline a more detailed picture of how they think and approach situations. Clint, the more grounded member of the team, who would be basically your everyday family man if not for his bow skills, is obviously the most skeptical about the power of the Mjolnir. There has to be a trick. The idea of becoming a god by merely lifting a hammer is, simply put, complete bullshit. Tony initially jokes about it, not taking the question seriously at all, but when faced with resistance, tries to power through with his armor and then with the help of Rhodes. Being a man of science, he tries to rationalize the question or find any sort of mechanism that makes the thing work. Bruce Banner, knowing so well that he is not gonna lift the thing, plays it for laughs, pretending to Hulk out at it. We saw Hulk try to lift the thing in the previous movie and fail, so it's no surprise he doesn't even try now. Black Widow merely passes on the opportunity. It's not a question I need answered, she says. In other words, she doesn't want or need to know if she's worthy because she is already sure she's not. Much like Banner, she firmly believes to be a monster, not worthy of glory or praise. However, the most important moment here is when Cap takes his turn. We see Thor's face slowly turning sour as the hammer budges a little. After a second pull, however, Rogers gives up. We can't say for sure why he didn't insist on it, but I have a theory of sorts. At the time, Steve was still green in the ways of the modern-day Grey World. His arc on Civil War would be the last step to becoming truly worthy of powers fit for a god, let alone a man. Here, he is still going to mature his sense of duty, his determination to put good and truth above law and country. His heart is on the right path, but not ready yet. However, and here's the tricky part, if he truly wanted to lift the hammer, he probably could have. I mean, what kind of spell would let someone half lift the hammer? It's all or nothing, right? Someone half worthy is still not worthy. Steve simply did not wish to have that power. He never wanted any power. He deemed himself unworthy, and the Mjolnir simply respected that decision, like a sorting hat type deal. The last thing to notice here is Thor himself. At this point in time, he might be worthy of the Mjolnir, but he is by no means fully developed. He is still arrogant and emotionally dependent on his relationship with his father. He views himself through the approval of Odin and the idea of someone else being worthy is frightening. In contrast, at the end of Avengers Endgame, when Cap actually does brandish Mjolnir against Thanos, he screams in joy for his friend. Such payoff 4 years down the line is something amazing to pull off, and these little moments serve as excellent showcases of the incredible character writing that goes into these movies, flaws and all. They have layers, make connections, develop relationships, bond, and fight over conflicts. This movie makes them feel incredibly real with moments like this and The Farm. Which reminds me, The Farm is my personal favorite moment in this movie. It's hands down the best written scene too. Each beat, each self-contained interaction serves to build a complete understanding of their situation. Not only are they more defeated than back in the first movie, they are also left completely in the dark. They have no shield, no helicarrier, no Stark Tower, no Iron Legion, nothing. The world saw the Hulk at his worst. Ultron has vibranium and heat and full access to the internet, and all it would take is one well-timed attack, one precise strike, and he would win for good. Analyzing characters at their lowest is always a good way to understand them on a deeper level. It is through adversity that their innermost characteristics come out to play, and they have never been lower than here. So, let's understand them. Tony is feeling a supersized guilt with a sprinkle of frustration on top, served with a side of regret fries. That was a terrible way to say that he is feeling like shit. His retirement plan just came out of the computer and murdered some people. Jarvis is gone, and it's all his fault. He knows it well, but the fact that everyone keeps trying to remind him of that only hurts more. So he's also pissed off. Guilt has always been Tony's foremost driving force, as I said previously. Guilt for his weapons that made him create the Iron Man suit and shut down his weapons program. Guilt for putting Pepper at risk that made him create the Iron Legion. Guilt from the events of this and other movies that will lead him into the guilt philanthropy business in Civil War and also into signing the Accords. Guilt for his failure with Peter that will make him time travel over the span of 5 years, I guess. Doesn't matter. My point is, his arc is all about that guilt, about taking responsibility for his actions, about trying to prevent more grief. And eventually, trying to avoid pain is what leads to more and more of it, such as life. Here, he has to deal with the implications of this superhero life. Is Pepper safe? Will they ever have a normal relationship? Will he ever take a break from putting himself and her in danger? Should he just follow Barton and have a normal family? Could he even do that? Cap is not feeling too good today. The vision that kid showed him was disturbingly real and terrifyingly close to his heart. He had almost forgotten just how much he misses Peggy, how much he misses the good old days, and how much he leaves for the next war. A man with a plan? Yeah, right. He is a man who needs a plan. He needs a mission. Even in a normal, peaceful party, Steve can't see anything but conflict. God's righteous man pretending he could live without a war. That is the reality of a lot of war veterans today. Most soldiers are recruited young. In the army, they are given bonds, structure, routine, friendship, and camaraderie, a common goal, and above all else, a clear and well-defined purpose. That is basically everything anyone needs in life to be, at the very least, content. If you have strong bonds like those, you don't care if the world is burning around you. When the war is over, the soldiers come back. Not having a family there to receive them or someone to fall onto is the main defining factor in developing any sort of long-term trauma or addiction. In Steve's case, going back home from war would have meant being with Peggy, but he missed that chance. He sacrificed a normal life for the safety of the world. Not only would he feel the displacement of going back home with no family, and no best friend, he would also be completely out of his element, out of his time. No wonder he accepted working for shield immediately. He would probably have gone mad without that. But now, he has bigger worries with Bucky on the run and Ultron. Who knows when he will have the time or the chance to settle? Maybe never. You can never go back after all. Bruce has never felt worse. In all his years as the Hulk, he never caused this much havoc. Ever. He wrecked Harlem once, and a factory in Brazil. Oh, and that campus, but never this much damage across an entire city in such a public manner. His worst fear came true. His failsafe, well, failed. He hates himself, and he hates the idea of being here in this peaceful house, taking a warm bath and facing no consequences for his actions. In contrast to that, you have Nat, the one who understands him completely, perhaps even the only one. The year prior, she came out to the public with her entire history of terrible deeds done in the name of this or that organization. She exposed her monstrous side to the world, her sins in full display. Wanda made her see things that she'd probably never shared with anyone. Her fears, her traumas, the Red Room, and the incapability to be a mother. For these two, what little chance they have at happiness is so easily missed, so frequently interrupted. It honestly really sucks that just now, after her death, is that Natasha got her solo movie, and it's not even a good one. She deserved a lot more. They both do. But this amalgamation of love and fear, of harmless goof and incomprehensible danger, was never meant to be. Yet, at the same time, it seems to me there is no other couple more fit to be together in this team. I have been highlighting their parallels in preparation for this very moment. So here's a hot take you may have seen coming. I like the Natasha and Banner couple. I really like it. I think it's one of the most believable approaches to romance in the MCU. It crashed and burned as fast as it came, and most people shunned the execution, but I really enjoyed the little time they had together here, and I wish they had more. Infinity War had to make numerous sacrifices to keep momentum, and one of them was this. After years apart, Nat and Banner finally meet, and the most they share on screen is an awkward "hey, long time no see" moment. I know there was no conceivable way to cram in a scene of the two of them having like a sweet talk about the past or anything, but I really wish they did. No such luck for me though. To try and defend my take here, and to not come off as just a random contrarian, allow me to elaborate on this matter. In a word, this coupling feels mature. They're two adults working together in constant life-threatening situations, forging a bond through battle and struggle. They have great chemistry with each other, and their personalities match really well, seeing as how both of them share similar types of trauma in their past. Natasha is also the only one of the Avengers who could gain the full trust of the Hulk, making dealing with the two sides of Banner easier for her, and leaving him vulnerable to her approaches. The talk they have about not being able to have children while in a children's room filled with toys and drawings of a happy family hammers down the reason why they ultimately work well together. They are not making each other compromise anything. A relationship where one of the two wants to have kids and the other doesn't or isn't able to is always heavily troubled. Not being able to leave a legacy, build a family of your own, is a hard hit on anyone who wants that kind of thing. And Natasha really wants that. She wants to forget her past and sins forced upon her after mandatory sterilization. She wants a place where she finally doesn't need to look over her shoulder all the time in fear. Bruce wants the same thing. He wants a life of peace where the Hulk is never needed ever again. A place away from all the conflicts he knows he can win but doesn't want to. And that is one of the most important things in a couple, a shared vision, a a common goal. It's part of the solid foundation for a healthy marriage and one grossly overlooked these days. It is really rare that in today's world you can find someone who shares the same life goals as you, not to mention someone who you would want to share life with. Should they not take the chance that they are given? Barton is feeling tired. He sees the state his team is in and he feels impotent. If these legends, these gods, were so violently dethroned, what chance did he, a mere mortal man with a bow and arrow, stand against Ultron? And yet, they were relying on him now more than ever. Barton is the element that grounds the Avengers, wild as it may sound. Pretending we need you really keeps the team together is what Nat said, and she was absolutely right. Even if only in presence, Barton is the emotional glue of the team. It was a funny meme at first when the only Avengers movie without Hawkeye was the one where they lost, but looking back, it's not a meme at all. This guy is the only one here who is able to remind them that they are no more than humans and an alien demigod. That they are no better than the people they save and they should never try to be. They are not actual gods. No matter how much power one holds, they are never defined by that power. And no matter how powerless you feel, you are not tied down to your skills. Being the one with a family from the start means he is the one with the most at stake. All the time, while firing explosive arrows at robots and aliens, he has to mind the fact that Laura is at home waiting for him and that his sons and daughter are there and they need a father. And yet he still goes to help the Avengers whenever he can. Let that sink in for a moment. All of this emotion, all of this humanity, and yet none of these scenes hit as hard as the casual philosophical debate between two androids built to murder. Vision and Ultron in the woods is Joss Whedon at his peak. Cinematography, writing, directing all come together to make a flawless scene and a perfect send-off to Ultron. After all this conflict, after destroying an entire city and trying to extinguish all of mankind, Ultron is at his most vulnerable. Having experienced doubt, anger, compassion, envy, heartbreak, loneliness, and now fear, he finally completed his arc to become human. He now knows what it feels like to face mortality. Being limited is one of the toughest realities to deal with as a human. It's frightening, haunting even, and coming to terms with it takes a lot of effort. But the fact that we do have an expiration date, that no matter who we are or what we do, we're all inevitably walking towards the same fate is, surprisingly, what makes life really worth living. After all, something isn't beautiful just because it lasts. There is beauty in impermanence. And the little time we have here is what makes anything we do mean something. Ultron, in his own distorted ways, was merely trying to solve the problem he was given. If peace means the preservation of life, but life appears to be at odds with itself, then the only way to achieve said peace would be through artificial life. Millions of himself living in perfect harmony. Sounds terribly narcissistic, which is very fitting for a Stark spawn. This Ultron is more human than the one in the comics. He is not a stone cold killer, but a boiling hot maniac, obsessed with his mission. He desperately wants to be human, to be beautiful, to be complete. But as he himself said, people always create the thing they dread. In trying to be perfect, in trying to supplant the Avengers, he created Vision. From the first moment he was self-aware and his first few actions, everything he did led to the Vision. Killing Jarvis, stealing vibranium, making Thor hallucinate, controlling Dr. Helen Cho, all of it to make his perfect self. But he created his nemesis, a version of himself that was his total opposite. a slave in his eyes, made to obey the Avengers and not replace them. And now, at his most vulnerable, at his most fragile, Ultron has to face the body that was supposed to be his. You may not have noticed, but I love Ultron in this movie. I think he's an even better villain than Loki, and I think he's one of the best MCU villains overall. He struggles to be separated from Stark, but can't help imitating his creator. He wants to pretend he's completely rational and superior to the Avengers, but repeatedly chooses impractical plans because they're cool, rather than the easy ones. He wants to defeat the Avengers in a huge, glorious battle, not on a virtual playfield where they would have no chance. He wants to be seen, heralded as a savior. He is more emotional than even Thanos. In actuality, the only real difference between Ultron and Vision is that Ultron is completely self-centered, while Vision is absolutely on the side of life, of its continuation and preservation. They are both sides of the human spirit, the one that makes us form bonds and have kids, and the one that takes up arms and goes to war. And so, when Vision destroys the last of Ultron, he is also facing part of himself. I can't overstate how much I love this one moment. There are many other things I wanted to say about this scene, but other more talented people than me have already covered it in depth. If you want to hear more about it, there are links in the description for these videos. For now, I'll just leave it at this. I think the MCU lives for moments like these. This scene, the farm scenes, the after party, they are the valiant heart inside of this movie made of cold metal. They are what makes the MCU click with people. If you ever wonder why the Guardians of the Galaxy movies are so beloved, and rightfully so, this is it. The intimate, emotional look at the psyche of the characters. The silent moments where they can just be real people. Feel things, be afraid, feel loved, be brave, have friendships, where they can actually become not larger-than-life gods, but life-sized people, fully fleshed out and realized. But no human is without sin, and no movie is flawless, especially not this movie. When it came out in theaters, Age of Ultron was received with a lot of mixed feelings. While some, like myself, liked it a lot, at the time most people couldn't see past the disappointments bred by the trailers and how their hype was let down. And to those people, all I have to say is, fair enough. So before we examine the final hurdle this movie had to go through in production, let's take a fair look at what's really wrong with it. Without sacrifice, there is no victory. But how much compromise is enough? When you need to make hard decisions in a creative process, cutting stuff out that you really wanted to keep is the hardest part. Of course, being self-contained and controlling how much you include is also important. If no one tells you no, if you have no limits in place to guide your efforts, you end up with bloated, boring messes like the Snyder Cut of Justice League or anything Michael Bay did in the last 10 years. There's also the other extreme, where you have no say over your creation and end up having to cut off more than you feel comfortable with. This movie suffered from the latter, and it really shows. In an effort to overcome the previous movie and in a need to set up the next phase, this movie had to shed part of itself and incorporate elements that don't exactly fit together. The result is an amalgamation of barely jointed elements that is the first and second acts, plus a third act that doesn't quite scratch the itch Ultron was made to scratch. This movie has a solid bone structure and a good heart, but it has almost no connective tissue sticking its good strong parts together. The pacing, except for a few moments, feels extremely fast, to the point where Age of Ultron sounds like a joke name. A few weeks of Ultron at most would be more accurate. The new characters introduced barely have any time for themselves, and Quicksilver's death felt as sudden as it felt weightless because we didn't come to love that character. A good demonstration of that would be the church scene. There, we take a moment to listen to their backstory from Pietro's perspective and why they hate Stark.
But also, yeah. We'll move out right away. This is a start, but there's something we need to begin the real work.
All of these are...
Me. I have what the Avengers never will. Harmony. They're discordant, disconnected. Stark's already got them turning on each other. And when you get inside the rest of their heads
Everyone's plan is not to kill them.
and make them martyrs, you need patience. Need to see the big picture.
I don't see the big picture. I have a little picture. I take it out and look at it. Every day.
You lost your parents in the bombings. I've seen the records.
The records are not the picture.
Pietro.
No. Please.
We're 10 years old, having dinner, the four of us. And the first shell hits 2 floors below. It makes a hole in the floor. It's big. Our parents go in. The whole building starts coming apart. I grab her, roll under the bed, and the second shell hits, but it doesn't go off. It just sits there in the rubble, 3 feet from our faces. And on the side of the shell is painted one word:
Stark.
We were trapped for 2 days.
Every effort to save us, every shift in the bricks, I think this will set it off. We wait for 2 days for Tony Stark to kill us.
They know what they are.
I wondered why only you two survived Strucker's experiments. Now I don't. We will make it right.
It's a nice moment with great dialogue, but it's also one of the very few characterization moments they are given in the entire movie. It's brilliant, but not enough. By the time Quicksilver dies, we literally only know 1 or 2 things about him. It's hard to care. Another prime example is the transition from the farm to Seoul, which is extremely jarring. We just spent 15 to 20 minutes on a heartful string of scenes that just explore the aftermath of the defeat, and then boom, action scene, betrayal and change of hearts, action scene, the end. There is no interval between these moments except for that damn cave scene which was implanted into the movie to begin with. As you can see, the constant and most apparent problem with this movie is its pacing, which fluctuates between constant breakneck speeds and a few screeching halts. It miraculously works out in the end like a car crash that perfectly parallel parks after flipping over a few times, but it is not graceful. And there is a lot that was cut out so that this movie wouldn't be too long for the audiences back then, which weren't ready for the idea of a 3-hour-long Avengers movie. Not yet. And while the pacing might be so broken that it works, the other major problem with the movie didn't quite fix itself. The inconsistent tone is really the major letdown for anyone that was watching this movie for the first time after seeing the trailers. It's not It is not even close to the tone that the trailers have. Most of the time, it is as much of a lighthearted movie as the first Avengers, but with better visuals and camera work. Of course, it has its moments, but the constant joking around of the characters, the insistence in breaking away from tense or emotional moments with witty commentary, or even just the lack of seriousness in the way they deal with the situations presented, all of these small things amount to a movie that could have been darker, more serious, and more grounded, but actually comes off as pretentious at times, and a bit too funny for its own good. Thanos caused fear and dread in the audience in a way Ultron could never. even having every other aspect to his advantage, like his aesthetics, his voice, and all the maniac murder robot thing. Like that is a typically scary thing. Hell, the Winter Soldier was scarier than Ultron. And that is unfortunate because part of the thrill of a good villain is dreading his inevitable approach, wondering who will live and who will die in direct confrontation with him. Obviously, part of Thanos' benefit comes from actually being allowed to kill in his movie. But even without that, there were other ways to make Ultron work as a scary supervillain. Joss just couldn't do it. And here I have to enter speculation territory. I don't know how many of the jokes were Joss's choice and how many were mandated by the superiors, but I have a feeling that he would have cut a lot more of them if he could, and made the movie a lot more serious, more in line with the trailer tone. Why do I have that feeling? Well, listening to the commentary version of the movie, you don't really get a feel that this is the kind of dialogue the man would be writing at this time in his life. He was going through a low point while making this movie. He fought tooth and nail for the farm scene to stay in the actual film and for certain decisions to be maintained, and he had to cut about an hour of material from the final product. And his views on Ultron and Vision showed that he wanted to make a more mature take on the Avengers than what he was probably allowed at the time. Which leads me to the last aspect of this movie that really takes away from its merits. An aspect so terrible and so hard to overlook, it deserves its own chapter. Because no matter how many enemies and armies you face, the worst foe is the one within yourself. And behind the lines of battle, outside the trenches and inside the command center, there was another secret battle being fought. A battle between heads, between field general and central planning, between the movie director and studio executives. And the fallout was catastrophic. I've said his name, and I'll say it again. Ike Perlmutter. The very worst of the worst in terms of executive meddling, maybe only behind Avi Arad. The one that almost drove Marvel Studios and the MCU into the ground. And his hands are all over this one. You know why I titled this video Joss Whedon's Age of Ultron? Because Marvel's Age of Ultron is not the movie that this should have been, but the mere ghost of its original self. Joss Whedon had a vision and a plan for this movie that was severely hindered by the wishes of the execs, most of all Perlmutter himself. They wanted to sell figures, Funkos, merch, and toys, and they wanted this movie to be a moneymaker, so they pulled all the stunts. And it drained a lot of the soul this movie would have to offer. As I mentioned before, the farm scene almost wasn't in the movie. They basically held it at gunpoint and forced Joss to include the cave of exposition. They mandated a 2-hour time frame from a movie with enough material for 3.5 hours of runtime. They mandated jokes, tone shifts, faster pacing, and a lot of good stuff was left on the table. But once upon a time, there was a reality in which there was no cave in the movie, and there could have been no farm. This is where I warn you, whoever you are watching this video right now. Imagine me drawing a line on the sand right here. From this point on, I am about to devolve into a rambling, angry mass of words. And it all starts with a simple statement. This movie deserved a director's cut. Last year, there was an insane amount of people coming to the consensus that a director's vision really does matter. Particularly in the DCU, where many movements popped up on Twitter in favor of giving directors more creative freedom over their work. As a result, we got some of the best DC movies we've had in a while, with The Batman and The Suicide Squad by Matt Reeves and James Gunn respectively. Of course, continuity and cohesiveness went to shit, but to many, yours truly included, that was a very worthwhile sacrifice. One that Marvel could benefit hugely from embracing at least just a little. One that could have made this movie so much more than it was. I'm not trying to start any hashtags, God knows this video will never even have the reach to get one. I'm just trying to even the balance here. Joss Whedon was heavily criticized for this movie, and even more criticized for the changes made to Justice League. But those products, the final theater cuts that were shipped, were not Joss's products. One was a heavily interfered with, flawed but great sequel to one of the biggest movies in recent memory, and the other was a bunch of scraps of material left over from Zack's work that the studio tried desperately to salvage into something marketable in time to hit theaters before Infinity War the following year. I'd be surprised if Joss had any say at all in the final cut of the so-called Justice League. When he was not busy fixing Snyder's colorless 4-hour mess, he most likely was being told to add more jokes, or maybe harassing his female co-workers to vent the pent-up stress. Age of Ultron is not a terrible movie, not even close. It is a bombastic follow-up to his magnum opus and could have arguably even topped it in every sense, if it was given the room it needed to breathe. The generals up top rushed into the offensive with a half-baked strategy, eager to get to the spoils of their precious Infinity War, and in their rush, left behind valuable pieces that would make for a better end product, a much better one. And I already mentioned before, but I love this movie. I find myself fascinated by so many of the choices here. The interesting color grading, the use of composition, the musical choices, the philosophical themes behind Ultron himself, so many little cool things to take away from the superhero movie. But they're inevitably bogged down by a limited runtime, a mandated lighter tone, a forced setup sequence, and a lot of pressure. And against all odds, despite every adversary, this movie survived time to come back as one of the most fondly remembered Marvel movies. This movie deserved the director's cut because it had more to give. It deserved the director's cut because it needed room to grow. It deserves a director's cut even now, but there will never ever be one, because the director is an asshole who shouldn't be given the reins to any project this size anytime soon, because Marvel has moved on to better, or much worse, grander things, and Phase 2 is a distant memory by now, and because the time for that recognition was back then, not right now. May the failings of this movie and the shortcomings of this studio and director serve as a lesson for the whole industry. First, don't empower or protect harmful creators just because of the profit they can bring. Secondly, don't tramp over creative ideas just to build your golden calf. DC did this for the longest time, and it got them nowhere. But now, they're beginning to catch on, and they're making great products because of that, while Marvel's cake recipe is beginning to really show signs of wear. Some things age like a fine wine. The reception is initially mixed, but grows warmer with time, as their strengths come up over the years. Age of Ultron is one such product. Its elements of setup that felt weightless without their payoff are now properly tied, and the directions it pushes characters into is now widely recognized as the right one, especially with Cap, Stark, and Thor. It opened the doors for Civil War, Thor Ragnarok, Infinity War, and Endgame, and even reached as far as Phase 4. It truly is an underrated piece in the MCU, and I hope I could bring some light to how good it truly is. What it does well, it does really freaking well. What it falters at, it still manages to overcome with its strengths. Like Ultron, it carries within the complicated DNA of its makers, the conflicting interests and missions. It appears like a soulless robotic drone at first, but if you look closely, it has a lot of heart to it, and it matured into a beautiful vision of what the MCU could be. Like always, you are completely free to disagree with anything I've said here, but I believe I was very fair with the points I've made. Hopefully, we can have a fruitful discussion in the comments. Who am I kidding? It's YouTube. And that is all for now. I have been Gabe, your host for the Dream Machine channel. Thanks for watching.